Welcome, everyone, to the Reader's Digest Book Club. I am Tracy Nethercott, your host, and I am thrilled today to be joined by Isabella Cañas. She is the author of the Hacienda. She is also the USA Today bestselling author of Vampires of El Norte, which is our October book club pick. Isabel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely thrilled.
It is Isabel. I don't know why I said Isabella, but it is Isabel. So I have to say, this book, we saved it for October because it's perfect for Halloween. And I read this a while ago, and I feel like I am already ready to reread it and saving it for next week when it comes time. For those of us who have not read the book once or twice, can you give just a quick summary of what the book is about, what they can expect, and some of the plot?
Absolutely. So, Vampires of El Norte is set in 1846. It's set in what is now South Texas, on the Texas-Mexico border, which is where my family's from. And it's about, I would call it a supernatural Western, if you will. It's set on a rancho. It's about two young people, Nena and Nestor, who are childhood sweethearts. Nena is the daughter of the ranch owner, and Nestor is the son of a vaquero, so of the working class. He's a cowboy. And when they're 13 years old, they experience a very uncanny attack in the night. And Nestor believes that Nena is dead. And he runs away because he is absolutely bereft that his actions led to Nena's violent death at the hands of they do not know what in the dark in the rancho at night. And they're separated for 9 years. Nena is, of course, not dead. She was the victim of what we later learn is a vampire attack. And they're reunited 9 years later, thrown together on the road to war because the Mexican-American War has just begun. Nena is a curandera, or a healer, accompanying the soldiers to war, and Nestor, as a cowboy, is joining an auxiliary cavalry to fight. And they have to work through their past and present romantic problems in order to protect their rancho in the future from threats both human and supernatural.
I love it. I love it. You sort of touched on this in the description, but if anyone's listening to that, they'll sort of be able to check off the genres, right? So this is being pitched as or sold as Gothic horror, which it is, but there's also a romance. And as you said, there's a bit of a Western happening, and it's historical. So you have so many different genres in here, all mashed up. And it honestly sounds like it should not work because there's so many, but it really, really does. So,
I mean, when I was in the middle of writing it, I was pretty sure it wasn't going to work.
No, it does. It does. And they all come together so nicely. But how did you make that happen? And also, what made you decide to sort of layer in all those elements?
I think I'll start with the second part of that question. Like, why did I choose to juggle this many balls, so to speak, while writing this book? I wrote the book I wanted to read. I think that's where the best books come from. I wrote for me. I wanted to, I just had I had an itch for a Western. I wanted something with a hot cowboy. I wanted something set in Texas, which is where my mom's family is from and where I am right now. I'm in Austin. This is set in South Texas. And I just wanted that. And I couldn't find exactly what I wanted. And so I had that moment of realization where I was like, damn it, do I have to write the thing I want to read? The answer was yes. And so I delved in. The exercise of balancing all of those elements, because like you said, we have horror, Western, historical, romance. It was very tricky. Actually, of all my books that I've ever written, this was the most difficult in terms of all of the genre elements, because each of these genres comes with specific expectations that the reader, goes in expecting, hence the term expectations. So, like with the romance, for example, the structure of the book, its skeleton is that of a romance. They're two people, they fall in love, they have problems. It's a second chance romance, which is my personal catnip, and it has a happily ever after. Now, that was very difficult in terms of the historical period because I, as a Mexican American, especially one whose family is from Texas, I look at the Mexican American War, and it's not in Mexican historiography. It's called the North American Invasion.
Mhm.
It's not a story that has a happy ending. It's a shameful moment in Mexican history, and for people who were living in South Texas and other parts of the Southwest, it was a moment of cultural death. It was a great tragedy and a tectonic shift. Like, I cannot stress how big of a change it must have been for these people to be one day living knowing that they were citizens of Mexico, and almost overnight um, to be citizens of an invading country, to have the border move over their heads, move over their ancestral lands, like move, and to suddenly find themselves the citizens of a hostile country, a country that was not kind or welcoming of them and their culture and their history. So, in fact, wanted to erase it and has actively worked for centuries to do so. So it was tough to fit happily ever after into that period for me, but I think I swung it. This book definitely has a happily ever after. For those of you who haven't yet um, dived in, it does. I can promise that. But the historical elements were also tricky. I did a lot of research. I also had to balance the horror elements as well. And
Mhm.
balancing horror with romance is kind of becoming my shtick, and I'm not mad about it. The Hacienda also has horror and romance. For those of you who haven't read it, there's a bit of forbidden romance. If you like the hot priest from Fleabag, come on in. We're here to welcome you. Like, come to the Hacienda. Um, One thing that's tricky balancing those two genres, while I believe they have a lot in common, believe it or not, one thing that's
Mhm.
tricky is like, okay, well, how do make characters kiss when there are monsters after them?
Yeah.
The timing of that is crucial. So you don't want to interrupt the horror and the tension, but also you don't want to lose the romantic tension and get the payoff for that. Because what do we live for when we're reading a romance? We want that sweet, sweet payoff to happen. And so balancing the two is sometimes kind of tricky. So I have often said that this book kicked my ass halfway into next Tuesday, and I mean it. It was a journey to write it, and I'm so happy that it is in readers' hands now because it's your problem now, no longer mine.
Not a problem. But I think you're right. I like the point that you made about horror and romance because
Mhm.
yeah, they almost feel like complete opposites, but they both thrive on the tension and those big moments, whether it's a big scare or a big like swoon, and yeah, they
Absolutely.
do not seem like they would go well together, but whatever you're doing, whether you're scaring us or ratcheting up the tension that way, or, you're playing with emotions, which
You have
together
touched
is
on
like
exactly. Yes, yes, I'm on my soapbox and I'm holding your hand because you're right there too. Because like the thing is with horror and romance is that they're genres of affect. They don't work unless the feeling is there. And so the challenge as a writer with both of these genres, and so on a technical level, it's a very similar skill set, is how do I take black words on a white page and make the reader feel something? Like that is my job, and it's actually pretty difficult because with horror and with romance there are things that the written word does not provide that we do get in other media. So for example, in movies and TV, when you're watching a horror movie, there's music. I just
yeah,
watched Alien for the first time with my husband, and freaked me out, but it's so tense because of the lighting. The way that Ridley Scott plays with the lighting is really powerful for making the spaceship really scary and making me, the viewer, really scared. When you're watching a rom com, what do you have? You have the actors and their extremely expressive faces. You can have a scene that's just like so tense with sexual chemistry between two actors that you can see on screen, even though there's no dialogue exchanged.
yeah.
And the challenge is for a writer, how do you translate that to the page? So with horror and romance, you are suddenly, it's almost like trying to do this. It's like that famous quote with Ginger Rogers, like she did everything Fred Astaire did, just backwards in high heels. So I think that's what writers are doing with horror and romance, because we're scaring you, we're making you swoon backwards in high heels.
Yes, exactly. But I do want to say for the people who are like, horror is not my thing, and I count myself in that. I am not a massive horror fan, and I should say a certain type of horror, and I want to get
Mhm.
into this particular type of horror. Um, but what I found, and I think what a lot of our members found too, is that this is, if you don't like horror, this is a book that you will still love, because there are all these other elements, and it's not, this isn't like Texas Chainsaw Murder. Like, this isn't gross out, or it's this creeping, slowly creeping up on you type of horror where it's very tense, and we, aren't seeing uh all of these monsters on the page right away. I mean, this is my type of horror, and I love the way that it was just very gradual sense of like, something is not right. Something is, very
Yes,
wrong.
that feeling of the uncanny, that eerie
Yeah.
feeling, that creepy feeling that sends like the little hairs in your arm standing on
Mhm.
end. I love
But
that
I
in a
will
book. It does
mention,
make me happy.
I have to tell you this, I saved a quote that a member wrote that said, "I don't like horror books." And for that reason, I wasn't going to read it. But I saw a review that said it was reviewed as romance. And I am glad I read it, and that the vampires didn't give me nightmares. So definitely, if you count yourself in that camp, yeah, you should definitely pick this up. If you don't count yourself in that camp, you're fine. You love horror, go for it. But I did want to mention that, because as someone who's a big baby about bugs, and therefore
Mhm.
stays away from horror for that reason,
Mhm.
this one's safe. So yeah, it's
Yeah,
so
I
good.
think yeah. Horror is a really intimidating genre to approach as a reader, and I certainly feel the same way because there's a certain kind of horror I like. I've discovered I really love that dread. I love that tension.
Mhm.
I love atmosphere. I loved reading really gothic things when I was a teenager, like Dracula, like the old school stuff, Wuthering
Mhm.
Heights. I love Rebecca. I love The Haunting of Hill House. Like those, that is the kind of horror that I enjoy personally, and I think like when you just go to the horror section of a bookstore, it doesn't have all of these tidy like subgenres. You have to find it kind of, you have to go in blindly and kind of just like reach for something and see if it fits, see if it's the right thing for you. And I think it's just like going into the romance section. You're like, do you want spice? Do you want closed door? Like you have to kind of do some work to sift through it. But horror, because it is scary, and sometimes can have content that is very triggering, is it's a bit of a minefield, honestly. So yeah, I'd say Vampires of El Norte is definitely more of an entry level horror because
Mhm.
it has scary monsters, but really the tool that it leans on the most is the sense of dread and, like Tracy was saying, the sense of the uncanny, the sense that something is not right out there in the dark. So it plays with that more than it plays with like gore, although there is a bit of a gore scene in the middle.
Well, and
Just a
it's
little
a
one,
really
as a
good, like,
treat.
yes. Apart from all that, it's a really good historical fiction novel, and I don't wanna jump
Thank
over
you.
that, and I will get into all of that a bit more, because I think there's so much to say there. But even just take out the horror, take out the romance, it's just really going to be appealing to historical fiction fans who, and I find this, like, maybe you've read a book that includes the Mexican American War, right? But this is, for me, it felt like a very fresh take, because we're seeing it from a different perspective and getting information and perspective that, we may have learned about this, right? But this is not necessarily, history has different viewpoints, and this is not the viewpoint you usually learn about. So I thought that just alone, for me, was like a big strength, because it was getting to like get a feel. And you do, I mean, your writing is so atmospheric that you do feel like you are transported right to that moment, to that place. And it comes right to life, which I just thought was so great. So
Thank
I think
you.
having all of those genres, you know really is part of what makes this work so well, is because there's just so much to like there. Um, but I did want to mention, because we talked about Gothic horror and you named some of your favorites, and this is always compared. I've seen so many comparisons to Mexican Gothic, which is
Mhm.
appropriate. But maybe for people who are sort of not involved in the horror genre, or really don't look too much into like the subgenres, can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about how you would define Gothic horror, and what
Mhm.
you would say makes this, and your other book too, that type of horror?
Absolutely. So, I am an academic, but English literature is not my forte. I'm a historian by training, so I'm coming at this as a layperson, just like the readers here. Gothic horror, I would define it compared to the rest of horror as a genre that really relies on a sense of atmosphere, a claustrophobic atmosphere, a sense of dread. There's usually a big house involved. There's usually a lot of family secrets. There's usually like a young woman or an ingenue who comes into a new place and has to discover things. Aforementioned secrets. If think of Jane Eyre, think of Wuthering Heights. There's often romance involved, though not all Gothic horror involves romance. And there's usually an element, if not of speculative, there is often an element of madness or perhaps madness. So in The Haunting of Hill House, the main character is in a genuinely haunted as frick house, but she also feels like she's starting to lose it. And so there's ambiguity about is she going mad? Is she not? So madness is a critical part of the genre. There are often ghosts involved. That is, I think, what draws me the most to Gothic horror is like, I love ghosts. I'm terrified of the idea, but also I welcome them. I also live alongside them. So I feel like I'm the most like I wouldn't call myself like a believer in ghosts, but I'm like a very healthy skeptic. And I'm Mexican, so we have the Day of the Dead, and like there are beliefs about people who have passed on that are like that really lend themselves, I think, to this mode of fiction. The Gothic, that is. And so the Gothic, I think, is for people who aren't into like slasher horror, but who really love like atmosphere, big spooky houses, family secrets. Sometimes I say you would frequently find more of a slow burn in terms of the horror, and if there's romance involved, also with the romance, it's a waiting game. It's a genre that really relies on like the build of suspense and tension. It's a genre that I think really sings when the prose is on point, when the voice is very strong. It's almost like a dance when it's done well. It's just right to the music, tight, beautiful. It sucks you in. So that was a very meandering definition,
No, but
but it's the one that I'm working with as a writer.
and I think it'll give people an idea of what to expect in this book in particular, just knowing that that's you're describing that genre.
Yes, and now that I think of it, like the Gothic also deals with issues of class a lot of the time, and Vampires of El Norte also deals with class on the rancho. So in not exactly like your old English manor type setting, it's definitely a very different setting where the rancho is the main setting in this book. It's called Rancho Los Ojuelos, and it's where Nena, the main character, grows up, along with Nestor, her childhood sweetheart and later actual sweetheart. And Nena is the daughter of the owner of the rancho, so she's of a specific class, the landowning class, and Nestor is a vaquero, or a cowboy, and so a worker. And it's very much like an upstairs downstairs kind of relationship where they're not on equal footing, and that throws a lot of roadblocks in the path of their relationship.
It's great. And I did want to talk about this, so I saved a quote because I thought this was so great because I loved that edition of that theme and the way you talk about it. So for those of you who haven't read it, this is not a spoiler. You write, he was a man of dust who served men of silver. It was impossible not to know his place in the world. And you feel for him, but at the same time, you also feel for her, because she's also dealing with societal limitations. She is a woman who is expected to marry a certain way, who is expected to live a certain way, certainly not run off with a cowboy. So it's just the way it's written about this romance, but also just what each of them are dealing with before and after, we'll say, before something happens to her and he leaves, and then after when they have their reunion is just really, really well done. So I loved that aspect of it. I want to talk because you mentioned that you are a researcher. I know you were.
Yes.
Were you doing your PhD when you wrote this, or? Just
I was in between. I wrote this in between chapters of my dissertation,
okay.
so I was pretty burned out by the end.
Yeah, I was going to say, so not
Understatement of the
maybe
century.
all.
Just a
Um,
little burnt out, you know. Needed a nap or 3 for
yeah,
3
yeah.
years.
And now you have a baby, so you get a lot to
Yes,
do.
so I decided that
Um,
it wasn't hard enough to do writing while working on a dissertation. I decided to write with a baby.
exactly. I don't want to know what you're going to do for your next book. Like sleep deprivation. But so it makes me very curious what type of research you did for this. And I know some of our members were wondering the same thing,
Yes.
especially for the historical elements. And I want to start off because I did hear you talk about this elsewhere. You mentioned when you were thinking of adding a supernatural element to this book, you sort of thought, do vampires really fit here? Not in the sense that like vampires existed, did they exist in Mexico, but more of, is the insertion of vampires in 1840s Mexico authentic enough for the people who were living there at the time? So I found it fascinating what you found in your research. So maybe that's where you could
Yes.
use this jumping off point.
Let's start there, absolutely. So, like you said, I was worried at the start that I was shoehorning the vampire element in. I had sold a vampire novel to my publisher. I had come with an idea, and the rejections never stop in writing. It turns out, because even after the book deal, my editor and publisher were like, maybe save this part of the book and this part of the book. So the main character Nestor and
Mhm.
his history of having come from South Texas, which is where my family is from and has been for generations. And I realized, well, damn, that is in fact a good idea. Let's start there. And so I began building like take 2 on the vampire book. And the setting came to life so strongly. The characters walked onto the page fully formed, like Nestor swaggered right in, and he knew exactly who he was from the start. So he's very near and dear to me because he felt like a gift from the muse.
Mhm.
He just like walked up and was like, "Sup, here I am." It was beautiful. I loved working with him, like he's a person. Um, but the supernatural elements I struggled with to start, and I worried I was forcing it. And that's one thing that I really worry about as a writer, working with historical periods, is making sure everything just kind of fits and melds together well, because I do a lot with my books. It's a tall ask. My premises my premises are usually a tall ask. This book has a lot going on. There's the vampires, the romance, the social elements, the war, the historical period, and I struggled to juggle them all. And so I was really anyway, I was like fretting about it. And I went to go visit my mom. This was 2 summers ago, and I was pulling books off her shelves and reading just as I am wont to do. And
Mhm.
usually I one finds their way into my bag, or maybe 2 or 3 as I head home. So sorry, mom. But I read this book that had a quote from a Mexican politician called Cheno Cortina, who is a contemporary of the events that occur in Vampires of El Norte. And in the 1850s, he was known as the Rio Grande Robin Hood because he was a bit of an outlaw in addition to a landowner and a politician in South Texas. And he was Mexican American, and or Mexican at the start because the border moved over him at the end of the Mexican American War. And he wrote to his fellow Mexican citizens of the state of Texas in an open letter in a newspaper, like encouraging them to like stand up and defend themselves against the way their land was being taken, the way they were being taken advantage of by new settlers from the north. And he said, of these settlers, these Anglo settlers, quote, vampires in the guise of men came and scattered themselves among the settlements, um, because they were driven by your industry, excited the avarice which led
Mhm.
them. I have that quote in the author's note in the back of the book. And I write a little bit about it because my jaw hit the floor. Because I was like second guessing myself about these vampires all the way home, like night and day. It was something that really kept me up at night. And then I read this quote and I was like, if there was a literal historical figure who wrote in the 1850s, I think it was 1856 or 1859 or something, that he likened these settlers to vampires,
Yeah.
then, if it made sense to the people living there to call them vampires, let's run with it. Let's take that supernatural element and let's go. Because
Yeah.
apparently it made sense to the people living there at the time. So let's go to town.
It's
I think
almost
one of
so
the
perfect for what you had.
yeah,
Like, just
it
the
was so
idea
on the
that
nose.
yeah, it's almost like, I mean, because I don't wanna give the ending away, but the
Yeah.
vampires are more than vampires. Like,
Yes.
they are symbolizing a thing. So
Mhm.
the fact that that sort of really lines up with the historical view at the time is just I also was
This
very
is Yeah, I think when it comes to writing historical fiction, what I look for in my research is those moments where the idea that is like slowly brewing in my mind and the historical record just click. And
mhm,
there's a kismet, there's always a little bit of magic and incredible coincidences that happen. Um, it happened with the Asenda, it happened with this, it happened with my next book. So I feel like that is for me, the moments like that are my North Star. I'm usually interested in a lot of different elements when it comes to my books, but as long as there's that click, I can have faith that it's going to work out after a lot of hard work, but it's going to work out.
yeah. So what other type of research did you do? I mean, how far down that research rabbit hole did you go or let yourself go?
Tracy, I went so far. I enjoy the active research. It is something that I did for 7 years getting my
I mean, you
PhD
would
in
have
medieval
to.
Islamic history. Yeah, I definitely do. I definitely do. And I what I think about as a writer of historical fiction versus what I think about as an academic is for me it was really interesting to like sit back and think about this as I began to write Vampires of El Norte, my second whack at historical fiction, at least at the novel length. I am looking for things that are very practical, very everyday. Like, what would people have eaten? What would people
Mhm.
have worn? Like, what underwear are they wearing? What kind of boots do they wear? What do they call in terms of like vaquero or cowboy culture in 19th century Mexico? Like, what did they call their saddles and stirrups and bridles? Like, what do they call? Like, I'm a recovered horse girl. I'm like, of course we got to learn all the names for their attack. What did they eat when they were on the road? These characters are going to be riding to war as part of a war caravan. What are they cooking? What does that smell like? What kind of boots are they wearing? Do they get blisters? What is the yeah, so what plants grew in the valley? What kind of flora and fauna are we dealing with? Whereas as a academic, those are very far from my mind. As an academic, I studied popular literature. So I thought about this random dude in 14th century Anatolia who took folk tales or oral histories, orally transmitted stories, and wrote them down. Now, this ended up actually being extremely applicable to Vampires of El Norte because when I was working on my dissertation, I was thinking about this guy who wrote the story down and what his literary influences were. What did he read? What social class was he? What kind of stories would he have heard in passing or read on purpose, or like swapped with friends? What was his life like? That sort of stuff, and how did that influence the stories that he ended up telling? That survived to the present. And so when it came to Vampires of El Norte, I think actually that is the influence of my dissertation almost directly on Vampires of El Norte, because you'll notice that there are a lot of folk tales woven through the
Mhm.
book. And I researched a lot of folk tales from northern Mexico and South Texas. And it was so joyful to read these stories, and and to just be immersed in them, because that to me was where like I would find the voices of my characters and like what kind of jokes would they make, what kind of references, like we might make jokes about like I don't know, like what are like urban legends or folk tales, or like make a Bigfoot reference or whatever. And so what is the equivalent of that in
Mhm.
1840s Mexico? Well, you could like reference El Cuco, who is the boogeyman who features in this book.
Yeah.
Or there's like a folk hero called Pedro de Urdemañas, who was kind of like a folk hero, like who's the guy with the big cow? Paul Bunyan?
Oh,
Something
Paul
like that.
Bunyan, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it was like finding those folk stories and like weaving them in. And at one point Nestor, the cowboy, tells like a cowboy tall tale at a around a campfire, and it's his story with Nana, except he fictionalizes it and turns
Mhm.
it into a vaquero tall tale. And so like the power of story definitely drives the power of folktale, helps drive Vampires of El Norte in the end. And some people have told me that reading Vampires of El Norte feels like reading a folktale. And that brings me such joy because that's kind of that unbeknownst to me, that was the vibe that I was chasing, and I hope you get it when you read it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it also, like, reading all of that must have put you in sort of like that mindset of the time period anyways, where
Absolutely.
so it's not coming off as your draft isn't coming off as, like, super modern because, you sometimes read historical where you're like, that sounds like nowadays." Um
Yeah, it's very tricky to walk that line because what you're doing when you're writing historical fiction is um you are engaging, um how do I phrase this? The historical romance writer Courtney Milan once tweeted years ago, but it stuck with me, that the act of writing historical fiction is not about writing something that is historically accurate, but writing something that is historically plausible. Because you
Mm,
don't want to be perfectly historically accurate because you're at the end of the day, we're writing novels in the 21st century for a 21st century audience.
mhm,
But you're right. You don't want to be reading a historical novel where it's clearly a 21st century mentality that drives the main character to act in certain ways, because within the context of the world building, that doesn't make sense and shatters the suspension of disbelief. And then you don't believe in the story anymore. And what is the purpose of fiction but to like believe a story and to be suspended
yeah,
in um like a dream? You want to be suspended in that dreamlike state when you're reading a book. You want to be swept away and you don't want to think about anything else. And sometimes um a 21st century voice or an action that can be read as coming off too modern can really break that, and that's not what we want.
yeah,
And so with Vampires of El Norte, it was a tricky line to walk. I think in general for my books, it's a tricky line to walk because I want to write books about women with agency.
mhm,
I want to write books about women who are fighting for autonomy, fighting to maintain their autonomy. It's kind of my heart story that I keep coming back to. And I could probably chat with my therapist for hours about why that is the case, but I'll spare you guys. But it's tricky. So I write about women in contexts that want to rob them of their autonomy,
mhm,
whether that's the fact that they're living in the 19th century and they are, or earlier in some of my future works, um, where um, the social mores of the time restrict the
mhm,
actions of women. Um, there are women who live in a patriarchy, so that necessarily restricts them as well. And there are women who live in societies that are very beholden to Roman Catholic beliefs, which are patriarchal and extremely restrictive. So I, having grown up in a household that was Mexican and Catholic and very strict, I
uh,
find myself drawn to stories that are about breaking out of that, and fighting for something more and fighting for autonomy. And so,
mhm,
doing that in a 19th century setting, like I do have to make compromises. Like the happy ending is never perfect. This one does have a happy ending. The Hacienda has more of a bittersweet ending. Um, there are, yeah, it's never going to be like a big fat bow on top. But I think that sometimes those are the most satisfying endings where you think, like, yeah, this is plausible. It is plausible that Beatriz would leave the novel The Hacienda feeling this way. It is plausible that Nestor and Nena would have such and such
mhm.
relations with each other and with her family and with his family. So, yeah.
Well, and I think it's also like you can have the typical happy ending as you would imagine for a romance, a happily ever after, in historically what may not be a happy ending. So you could have a happy ending at the time that may not have its own happy ending. So it's kind of like
Yeah, like it's a happily ever after for the characters and maybe a happily for now for the historical period.
right,
And
right.
that for now being a little abbreviated.
Well, I wanted to talk about the historical period and the setting because you've
Yeah.
said that your family is from that area of Texas.
Mhm.
Did that shape at all how you told the story or the details you told or even
I
the
think it
choice to set it right there?
Yeah, I think it did. I um think I was drawn to write about this area because of my family connection to it. Um I also believe that the story I ended up telling and the way I told it were also influenced by my family. I I remember texting, like, I had a group chat with my mom and my aunt, whose house I'm at right now in Austin,
Mhm.
where I would ask them, like, "Okay, so I wanna have, like, a thunderstorm, but is that plausible for this time of year in the valley? Like, what do you think?" Because my mom was born in San Benito, raised in Harlingen. If your readers know where that is, wow, good for you, because it's my mom calls, Harlingen the two-horse town where no, the one-horse town where even the horse left. It's a
Okay.
little speck on the map in South Texas. So I would ask them about, like, give me details, like, what is and
Mhm.
so they would text me back, like, long blocks of text, like, "This is what the thunder would be like, this is what the air feels like before the storm breaks, this is what the lightning looks like, this is, like, these are the trees that would grow, and, like, you should look up, like, when did this kind of palm start to be planted in the valley, like, would it have existed in the 19th century?" So they were, like, it was so fun to, like, bond with them that way, to have them as, like,
Yeah.
creative sounding boards. And it helps provide so much historical detail. Like, my Aunt Rory, whose house I'm at, was like, there are not enough mosquitoes in your book. And frankly, there are a lot of mosquitoes in the valley. So poor Nana and Nestor end up getting very, very mosquito bitten by the end of the book. So my research ended up being very much archive and book driven, but also driven by talking to family. And it was really, really fun. And I think writing my books in general has been really rewarding in terms of my family, because I write us into them.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of marginalized writers begin writing because they look at their shelves or think of the books that they read growing up and felt, they're no part of the power of literature is that it's a mirror. It shows you that you're not alone. And I, growing up, reaching for genre fiction on the shelves, which was like my bread and butter growing up and continues to be to this day, I never found, heroines who looked like me, whose families sounded like mine. And so I ended up putting a lot of family dynamics in the book that resonate with my family, where they read them and they will text me being like, "Oh my god, this is so your cousin," or "Oh man, that is so your brother." And it's really fun.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like I said, I have not been huge in the horror world in particular. But I
Yeah.
think when you do, you think of horror, you think of for a very long time, those really big names that were a lot, like Stephen King or whatever.
Yeah.
But it within the past, I don't know, 5 years, something like that, you
Mhm.
see this more of a focus on communities or the type of hero or heroine that you wouldn't see necessarily in the past. With yours, I mentioned Mexican Gothic before. There's
Yeah.
Lone Women just came out, or Lone
Oh my
Woman, Lone.
god, I love that book so much.
Um,
It's so
I that's still on my list, so no spoilers. But you're seeing more and more of these stories, or I should say maybe the Changelings, and since that's one
yeah, absolutely.
just come out and maybe people would have seen.
Yes.
But you're seeing more of these stories. How important is it for you to like really center your horror in particular on communities or families like yours or areas where your family has lived for however many years or generations?
I think it's hugely important. I think in all genres, but especially, um, I think in all genres, it's really for me as a reader, I know, like, I read a lot of genres. I read science fiction, I read fantasy, I love magical realism, I love horror, obviously, and I'm probably like less into literary fiction. And I think for many, many years, thanks to the Latin American boom of the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s with Isabel Allende's The House of the Spirits, there was this expectation in Big Five publishing that if you were a Latin American writer or a writer of Latin American heritage, you would be writing magical realism.
Yeah.
And you get very shoehorned or very typecast, rather. And
Mhm.
I have had people, or I've seen on the internet, reviews calling the Asenda magical realism. And I'm like, sir, it is horror. It is certainly not magical realism, and neither is Vampires of El Norte. It is many things. I can promise you, I can tell you that for free. It is a lot of stuff, but it is not magical realism. And I think because of that, it's even more important to have representation in all genres. But I think horror in particular is interesting because horror allows us to. I mean, there's been a lot of ink spilled about this over the years. but their horror allows us as readers to dabble with and confront uh, traumas.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very powerful medium in that way. It can help us look at wounds that we have in a different context or through a different person's eyes, and that helps us heal. And it's a safe place because, you know, at the end of the day, it's fiction, and maybe the character, maybe it ends tragically, maybe it doesn't. One non-spoilery thing about Lone Women is that it kind of has a happy ending. Like, at least in my mind, it absolutely has a happy ending. Like, I adored it for that reason, but it's a rough road getting there. So I think, you know, readers who are from a more mainstream, according to publishing background, who are white, have had that for years. And I often think that, like, when it comes to Latinas in general, it's like when you think of the Latina population in the United States, so many of us have histories rooted in traumas, the trauma of forced migration, the traumas of sexism, racism, the whole experience of South Texas being forced into the United States after a war, and the experience of attempted and successful cultural erasure and ethnic cleansing it's dark and it's hard to grapple with. And when you come at it in fiction, particularly genre fiction, particularly horror, you're coming at it from such an angle that you can actually look at it, like, instead of facing it head on, which is really hard. Like, in some of my research, I was reading some stuff that just, like, makes me feel emotional right now because it's really dark history. There's a lot of death of people who are like me and my family. It's really hard to read about. But if you come at it from an angle, it's easier, and you can hear the truth, share the truth, experience the truth, grapple with it, deal with it, heal with it. But so horror is a very powerful medium in that way.
Yeah, I mean, and it's sort of you do this in your book, and it's sort of one thing that horror does allow is to compare what we think of as horrors, right? Like, yes, we think monsters, like vampires. Everyone would consider those things horrors, but there's, and like I said, I don't want to give away anything in yours, but there are other horrors, and we're talking human horrors, that it's sort of, the genre allows you to sort of compare the two without saying anything more. But
No
it allows
spoilers, no spoilers.
to look at, and like you were saying, look at those traumas, but then compare it to what you would naturally call a horror. Well, which is worse?
Absolutely.
Who's the bad guy? Who is the monster?
Yes. I think when it comes to horror featuring written by marginal or created by marginalized voices, one thing that you think of when you think of, like, and not just Stephen King, but like the host of kinds of writers that Stephen King represents, like the kind of the old white man writer. It's like, on a very fundamental level, the boomer white dude and I do not fear the same things. I'm a Mexican American woman. Like, we just aren't afraid of the same kinds of people, you know? We have very different histories with dealing with the outside world and deciding what is a threat to us or not, especially as a woman. I think why that's part of the reason that horror written by BIPOC voices in particular is so important, because it flips the script of traditional horror. Because so often, what is horror if not, there's a lot of horror that absolutely is structured around the fear of the other, you know, the dark other in particular. And so there's a lot of script flipping going on, and I could not be happier about that.
Yeah, and it's also just, you know, a fresh perspective too, that I think it does not mean that this is a book only for people who are from this community.
Not at all.
Especially from, you know, for other people who are reading it and wanting to expand their reading, which I think, you know, just as important, you know.
Exactly. So, because there's one thing that I'm learning, having these conversations with people like you and book clubs like this one, and also talking to other writers and working on my next books, is that, there are specific fears, but the power of horror is in the universal as well. So in the Asenda, which is a haunted house novel, there is this, I play with the universal fear of the dark in a house in particular. And in Vampires of El Norte, the universal fear that I play with is the fear that you have when you're out in the woods at night or out in an exposed place at night, there's nothing at your back, there's no light, and you know that there is a critter out there that is bigger than you and might want to eat you. And you just feel like the hairs on the back of your neck lift. Like it is such a powerful tool to play with. I love it. So I think
Yeah.
horror is also super special in that regard because
Yeah.
we do all fear the same things when it boils down to it. Like, yeah, I'm contradicting myself, but oh well.
No, I think that's true. And even romance too. Like that whole element of this book is super, universal as well. So I think there's a lot of elements there. I want to transition to some member questions to make sure we get to those. So, and I'm so glad someone asked this because I have to 100% agree. The cover of this book is gorgeous. It is beautiful.
I love her. I love her.
It is, and if you don't have the book or if you read it as an ebook, I should mention it. I really like the texture of the cover too, which I know is
Berkeley
random.
does such a good job.
Yes, it's kind of a grainy looking cover, but it also has the texture as well. So,
and she looks good naked too.
Yep.
It's got that shiny, shiny gold. And look what the designers did. It's like on the inside, boom.
So pretty.
It's so pretty.
So how did it come about? Like, I think people might think that authors have more say in their books covers than they do, but did you have any say? Did you see it ahead of time?
I did. Yeah, I'd say it depends on the publisher and it depends on the author. Some authors get a lot of say, some don't get any at all. I'm happy in the middle ground area that I exist in with my publisher, Berkeley, because at the end of the day, my job is to write books. That's what I'm a professional at. They're professionals when it comes to selling books. So there comes a point where I'm like, you got it, boss. Like, I trust you on this one. I think that this book was an interesting one because of how it straddles so many different genres. I imagine, and I've heard a little bit from my marketing and publicity people, that it provided different opportunities to be positioned. So, is it being sold to predominantly romance readers? Is it being sold to predominantly historical fiction readers? What about, Western? What about horror? Where does it sit on the shelf of the store? At the end of the day, I'm sorry, booksellers. It's your problem now, not mine.
Put it right in that front table under staff.
It'll fit fine just there. It'll fit fine just there. But covers, the purpose of a cover is to signal to different readers, like, hello, I am for you. There's a big trend in romance right now for illustrated covers. And so I think there was an early suggestion that maybe an illustrated cover would work for vampires. And so I saw a few drafts. I thought they were real cool. And in the end, the publisher was like, no, we're going to go in a different direction. Cue me being like, I trust you. Let's go. And this was one of the options that they came up with. There were, I think, 3 options that were kind of similar, but this one with the lightning, I said, give me this one or give me death.
Yeah.
That one's it. That one's it. That one's it. And I think sometimes authors, as I said earlier, like, it depends on the publisher. It depends on the author. We don't always get a say. But I'm very happy that I was able to say that one, because I just love it. I want to get it framed for my office.
Seriously, though, it's so pretty. And it does have that like moodiness that says horror, but it also, I mean, and obviously it looks like it's Western setting. So
yeah, we got some cacti, got some birds, we got like the swirling skirts. There's the storm, there's atmosphere. It does a lot of work. The designer did a brilliant job because, like I said, you have the purpose of a cover is not just to signal to readers, I am for you, but it also signals these are the vibes of the book. Like, one thing I let go of, or learned to let go of, with the cover of the Asenda, my first novel, was that, like, the dress is not historically accurate. Yeah. Of course it's not. The purpose of, the figure on the cover is to communicate this is a Gothic, this is sweeping and atmospheric. Because readers, when they're just scanning the bookshelves, you want something that'll catch the reader's eye, of course, but also something that says, hi, this is what I am. I am what you want. And so I think this cover accomplishes that in spades. Yes,
I love it. Someone else wrote, Is your first book, The Hacienda, also about the supernatural? You have an interesting, smooth, and fluid way of writing. I enjoy your writing very much, which I have to agree with. But I thought this would be a good point for you to just give a quick snapshot of what that book is about, because I know I can't be the only one who finished this and was like, okay, next.
Yes, okay, and it's just come out in paperback, the Hacienda, that is. The Hacienda is about a young woman named Beatriz, who is her family is in tough financial straits. It's just her and her mom at this point after the Mexican War for Independence. And she accepts a marriage proposal from a handsome widower who has a lot of secrets that she decides, you know what? I really need the money. I'm just not going to ask questions. So, famous last words. She travels with him to his ancestral family home in the countryside called Hacienda San Isidro, and he leaves her there and returns to the city to work. He's a politician. And Beatriz is there alone, apart from a surprise sister-in-law and some people who work on the hacienda who are very suspicious of her and not very friendly. And she discovers that the place is profoundly haunted and that no one seems to believe her. So she goes into town and seeks the help of a local priest called Padre Andres, who has a lot of secrets of his own. And haunted house, hijinks ensue, hot priest.
This is making me think of like Rebecca and
Absolutely.
some other very classic, like Jane Eyre type Gothic novels. So,
yes,
it sounds great.
thank
Before
you.
we go,
Yeah, it's yeah. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's my publisher calls it like a tale of witchcraft and suspense in 19th century Mexico. So
and
they're
if you
ghosts
like
as well.
book, yeah, similar genre, similar vibe. So you like
Absolutely elements of the supernatural to answer the question directly.
Mhm.
Like, yes, ma'am / sir, that is exactly what I peddle in.
There you go. Before we wrap up, I do want to ask this last member question, and I don't know how much of an answer you can give, but what are you currently working on?
I can't. My hands are tied, Tracy. My hands are tied. I can't say a whole lot yet. I will say this, however, of my future works that are upcoming. So that's plural. That's one of the tidbits I can give you. They are, I will say, cousins of the Asenda and Vampires of El Norte, in that they also are, well, one is fantasy, so I would call it a gothic fantasy. It also it deals with, I'd say, more recent Latin American history in fantasy clothing, and there are also ghosts and elements of horror in that regard, but also like kind of like ghosty, gentler horror, because that's
Mhm.
kind of more my jam, and a little bit of romance. And then another one is very much the spiritual sister of the Hacienda and Vampires of El Norte, in that we have Mexican history, in this case, colonial Mexican history, elements of the supernatural, very spooky elements of the supernatural, and romance as well. So that's something I can promise for the next few years is elements of Latin American history, elements of spooky and romance.
I like it. I like the mix. Where can, as we wait for those, for however long we have to wait, where can people find you, follow you, learn more about your books or what you're working on?
Absolutely. So I am on an Instagram hiatus at the moment, but you can find me on Instagram. That is my most frequently haunted social media platform. I don't really frequent many of the others anymore. Um, Otherwise, you can find information about my books and my short stories on isabelcañas.com. And on isabelcañas.com, you can also find a link to my newsletter, which is where you will get all of the updates from about future books, about future projects that I have going on, and also my short stories, because I do dabble in those. They come out every once in a while, and they might hold you over until the next novel. So yeah, isabelcañas.com or instagram.com/isabelcañas_.
Awesome.
That's where I can be found. Yeah.
And you guys can find that scrolling at the bottom. So you can just copy right from there. Isabel, thank
Mhm.
you so much for coming on, for talking about the book, for sort of diving into the background and your research and how you put it together. For those of you who have not gotten it, You guys, it's such a good book. It's such a good book, and it will appeal to so many different types of readers. So I highly, highly recommend this. I was not kidding when I said I am going to be rereading it. So it's so great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I know I am not the only one who is appreciative of that.
It was my pleasure. I'm really this book was hard to write, but I'm so happy with it. And the messages that I've gotten from readers thus far honestly make me want to cry because it works. It worked. I did it. And
Yes.
also it's resonating with y'all. So that brings me so much joy. And it was also a joy to talk to you today, Tracy. Thank you so
Oh,
much for having me.
it was such a blast. So thank you so much. And for everybody else, thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. And stay tuned for next month when we are going to be reading Dirty 30. And happy reading.